still remains.
You guys already know it's DNA. It's not fair. You guys are just, every time I ask you, like, it's DNA. Like, well, obviously it's DNA. But does this data table make sense why it supports the idea that DNA and not some other molecule carries the information?
No.
All right. Now, at the time, they weren't totally convinced. They purified the nucleic acids and treated them to degrade the proteins. But people were not totally convinced that it still wasn't proteins contaminating the mixture of DNA that actually carried the information. Scientists are a notoriously skeptical bunch, right? And they're not content just to say, oh, that sounds like a good idea. It's a pretty good experiment. Sure, let's accept it. People were critical of it, and not everyone accepted that it was DNA instead of protein. Which brings us to our next experiment. So this experiment is called the Hershey-Chase experiment, and it's the bottom of the first page of this activity. Now, this is the data from the experiment, and we're going to spend about 10 minutes or 15 minutes explaining the experiment before I ask you guys to try to interpret this graph. All right? Now, I told you earlier that there are these mysterious things called bacteriophages. And bacteriophages are just viruses that infect bacteria. So if you imagine, everything okay? All right. If you imagine a virus, and you guys have all probably had many viral infections in your lives. The cold is a type of viral infection, all right? Mono is a viral infection. H1N1. Those are all viral infections. So what is a virus? And what makes a virus different than a bacteria? Because for a lot of you, if I say that bacteriophages are viruses that infect bacteria, you're scratching your head thinking viruses are bacteria. How can there be a virus of a bacteria? But what's different in your exposure to sort of the medical literature? What's the difference between viruses and bacteria? What's that?
You can't get rid of viruses?
Sometimes the viruses can kind of lurk. It's true, like they can stay sort of resident within some cells of the body. So for instance, if you have something like herpes virus, where you get cold sores, they live kind of dormant in the nerves inside the cells and the nerves of your face. And then during periods of stress, they'll kind of break out and cause sores. So it is true that it can be really hard to get rid of viruses, especially when they're sort of tucked away within cells. Yeah.
The only real thing that I know the difference between the two is that one's a living organism and the other one isn't. And I'm supposing that's probably why one's easier to kill than the other.
So one's living and one isn't. So remember we talked a little bit about the properties of life? You guys remember that? So one of the properties of life that people often use is that living things have this structure that we call cellular, where they have that phospholipid bilayer that encircles them and keeps the out and the in. Well, viruses don't have that. They don't have any of the machinery that normal cells do. They're literally just a protein wrapping around a nucleic acid core. So if you look at a virus, and you look at a virus that infects a bacteria, if you imagine this is our bacteria, well, the bacteriophage, I'm going to draw it like that, and I put a picture here so you don't think that I'm just making up its shape. This is an image of a bacteriophage. I put a few up here for you to ponder. They're really pretty, aren't they? No? They're kind of elegant. They have this beautiful sort of symmetrical kind of 10, 12-sided head, and then this sort of structure here. Kind of cool looking. Very popular toy as well, for those who get into such things. So if you look at a bacteriophage, the bacteriophage looks, they don't all look like this, but the ones we're interested in kind of have this structure. They have this head, this neck, and kind of these docking feet or arms. And all they're made out of is protein, and then in the case of this one, DNA. And so when you mix a bacteriophage together with bacteria, what happens is the bacteriophage latches onto the bacteria, and this is the same thing that happens when you get a viral infection. It injects information into your cell, and that information takes over your cell and makes your cell stop doing its normal activity and become a viral factory. And that's how viruses take over your body. They trick their way into your cell, release their information, and that information takes over your normal cellular processes. So when the bacteriophage docks on the bacteria, what it does is it injects information. And that information is sufficient to drive the production of many, many, many millions of more bacteriophages, who then get released and infect neighboring cells. So do you see why this would be a pretty cool system for figuring out what the information is chemically? It's just protein and DNA, and that's it. And it has all the information needed to take over a bacteria and make the bacteria make more of it. Okay. We're still not there yet. Do you guys remember the elements?
Wind, water.
All of them? Do you remember how the elements have these numbers and letters? Okay. And do you remember what this number tells you? So this is the atomic number, and that's equal to the number of protons and the number of electrons. And this, of course, is the atomic mass, and that's equal to the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Yes? Well, I believe we alluded to this at various points, and there was a section of the last lecture notes that talked more explicitly about this. But different elements can come in different atomic masses that we call isotopes. And so there are these things called isotopes that are the same element with a different atomic mass. So for instance, for carbon, there's 3 relatively abundant. I mean, by relatively abundant, I mean 1 is really common and the others are, a trillion times less common, but they're still present. Isotopes of carbon that naturally occur. There is carbon 12, there's carbon 13, and there's carbon 14. Okay? So this number is just referring to the atomic mass of the element. And as the number gets bigger, that means there's more what in the nucleus? There's more neutrons in the nucleus. So carbon 12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon 13? 7. Carbon 14? 8. Well, it turns out as you cram more neutrons into the nucleus of a cell, cram more neutrons into the nucleus of an element, you can destabilize the nucleus so that it becomes radioactive and it will decay. When it decays, it releases a particle of energy and becomes an element of a different atomic number and or mass. All right? So